Hello there. Let's do some practice questions for the CompTIA A Core 1 exam with my explanations and reasoning. Now before we get started, a bit of a disclaimer. Darkbird Tech, this channel, is not affiliated with CompTIA or any of CompTIA's partners. These questions I put together are meant to give you practice when you're preparing for the exam, but they are not the actual exam questions and answers. That would be a violation of the NDA that we all agreed to when we write a CompTIA exam. And also a violation of CompTIA's unauthorized preparation material policy. These questions, however, are there to give you a similar experience to what you'll get in the exam and how the knowledge can be tested, and that's why it's similar. Now, I have favored medium to difficult style questions in this video to give you a good gauge of how prepared you are for the exam. Now, let's talk about the workflow for this. So obviously I've written the questions for this video, but I'm going to play the role of the voice in your head, and we're going to pretend the questions are from CompTIA. Now, the way it's going to happen is the questions will pop up first. We'll run through the question. If you need to, pause the video at the time so you can have a look at the question at your own leisure rather than waiting for me to read it. And our options will then appear. We will look at the options and work out what the best answer should be for that question. And once we're done with that, we take a sip of coffee before moving on to the next one. So let's get into it. So first up, which of the following technologies allows for the automated allocation of IP address information to a client? So I'll give you a chance to think about the options you want to see. Pause if you need to. But the options are a VPN, DHCP, DNS, and VLANs. Now, this is going to be quite common in the A Core 1 exam, where you're going to get pretty straightforward questions where you just need to know the answer. It's a simple fact-answer style of questioning. And some of you might be going straight away for DHCP. For those of you that know straight away that's the answer. But for those of you that need to work it out, well, process of elimination. VPNs provide a secure tunnel, so not allocating IP addresses. DNS resolves names, so not DNS. And VLANs are about segmentation that is done logically across the network. So that is the first answer, DHCP. It allocates your IP address, your subnet mask, your default gateway, and any optional information, including the address of a DNS server. Moving along now. Which of the following drive connectors can be found in desktops, laptops, and servers? So this means we're looking at drive connection standards, not necessarily the actual storage media itself. And it's got to be present in a desktop, a laptop, and a server, which means it's going to be a very specific kind. I'll give you a chance about the options you want to see, but our options are Thunderbolt, SAS, M.2, and SCSI. Now, Thunderbolt is a peripheral connector, so not really, mainly because of the servers. Serially attached SCSI, or SAS, server specific, you won't find it on desktops and laptops. M.2, definitely on the desktops, definitely on the laptops, and very strong chance you'll find it on the motherboard of a server, so it's looking quite good so far. SCSI, bit of an old physical connection standard. We still do use the SCSI standard and protocol, but we don't use the connector anymore, and they were asking specifically for the connector, so that's a no. So it's M.2. Moving along. A user turns on their PC, and the image on the monitor is dark and difficult to see. Let's see what the options are, and then we'll work through them. So, first up, the power cable for the display is the first thing that they'll list here as an option. And the complaint is a user turns on their PC and the monitor is dark and difficult to see, but they can still see it. So that means it is receiving power and an image is being generated, so it's not the power cable. If it were the power cable of the monitor or the display, then we would not see an image at all, or it would be off on, off on, off on. Alright, the video driver version. That would not be a bad idea to check that. But let's see what the other options are and see if there's maybe a better choice here. And this is one of the things you want to be doing with this exam, is looking for the better choice, even if you see one that does look decent.
run through all the options before you settle on your answer. The backlight source of the display, that is a very strong contender. The backlight might have failed on the monitor, but the brightness settings of the display, I like that, because this is what we should check first. I would actually probably check all of these things, with the exception of the power cable, because we actually are getting an image. And the first thing I would do is I'd check the brightness setting on the display, or the monitor, as there's a very strong chance it might be turned all the way down. If that doesn't make a difference, then I would think about maybe the backlight of the monitor is not working, and I could go and maybe try swapping it out with a known good. But for now, I'm not going to go for that one. That might be the second or the third thing I check. And then checking the video driver version. Okay, it's going to be kind of difficult to do if the monitor is very hard to see, but if I swap for a known good, then I know the monitor is the cause of the problem and not the video driver. So I can eliminate that. So I'd go for the brightness settings on the monitor first, and then maybe the other things. Remember, it's about what we're going to check first, not what we're going to check only. And watch out for that, because they do that in the exam quite a lot, where all the options are things you would probably want to check. But they're asking you to check the first thing. But let's move on now. Next up, which of the following are two common pinouts for twisted pair Ethernet cables? Choose two. Now, always do yourself a favor, make a note when you see that, because that means there's going to be quite a few options and we must choose more than one of them. CompTIA is pretty cool though, they do tell you how many to choose. So let's see what the options are. T568A, T568B, RS232, RS485, and EIA561. These are all correct and valid pinouts for various kinds of cables that are used in networking in various ways. But they're asking specifically about twisted pair Ethernet cables. And for those of you that remember that quite well, the answer is those two. RS232 and RS485, these are serial cables, not twisted pair Ethernet. And EIA561 is also not the option here, because this is a serial to RJ45, usually used for the console connection to an enterprise network appliance. Now, if you were looking at this going, but I don't know RS232, I don't know RS485, I don't know EIA561, but you should recognize T568A and T568B. So if that's what you recognize and the other you don't recognize, go with what you know. Go with what you believe to be correct. This can be one of those agonizing questions in the exam, though, because you might worry about, what if the thing I don't know is the right answer? Breathe, think about the question, and see, do you see options that are correct? Moving along, though. Next up, which of these RAM characteristics is not commonly found on PCs? I'll give you a chance to think about it. Pause if you want to. But our options are dual channel, DDR4, triple channel, and ECC. Now, all of these are RAM features. So it's going to be kind of difficult to eliminate them. But they said PCs. So this would mean desktops and laptops. A server class feature. Now, dual channel is a common feature across all modern computers, whether it be a laptop, a desktop, or a server. In fact, more than likely you're going to see triple channel and quad channel nowadays. So we can eliminate A and C straight away there. Then DDR4 is a data rate multiplier. So that's something you probably would see again on all RAM form factors, leaving us with ECC. Now, some of you might have jumped straight to ECC as it came up, and if you did, fantastic. If you didn't, don't feel bad. Process elimination works wonders. But what is ECC? ECC, or error correction code, is a feature in RAM that allows the RAM modules to correct when a binary bit flips. Now, this is obviously very useful for data stability and overall system stability, and that would be massively beneficial on a server. You don't want to waste processing cycles fixing issues, as those wasted processing cycles affect overall performance and everybody who relies on that server. But having that on an end-user computer, like a laptop or a desktop, not really worth it. That's that answer, so let's move on to our next question. Which of the following printer types has the fewest moving parts? Oh yay, a printing question. Give you a chance to think about the kinds of printers you'd like to see here. Pause if you want to. but our options are thermal, inkjet, impact, and laser. So we're looking for the fewest moving parts. Now the answer is thermal, and the reason why is there's only one thing that moves in a thermal printer: the paper feed mechanism. That is it. With an inkjet, you've got the paper rollers and you've got the carriage that holds either the cartridges or the nozzles if the inkjet printer uses a tank of liquid instead of a cartridge. So more moving parts than the thermal. Then you get an impact printer, and there are two main kinds. You get a daisy wheel and a dot matrix. Either way though, you've got paper rollers, and then you've got something that's got to move around and make indents on the paper, because impact works by making actual contact with the page, so not that. And then with a laser printer, you've got quite a lot of moving parts. You've got the pickup rollers and the feeder rollers for the paper. You've got the electrophotographic drum. You've got the laser or the mirror for the laser that moves. You've got the toner adder roller. You've got a lot of things going on a laser printer that are moving. So of them all, the thermal printer is the one with the least moving parts. Moving along though, to our next question. Which of the following wireless LAN standards has the best throughput and security associated with it? Give you a chance to think about what you'd like to see here. But our options are 802.11b, 802.11ac, 802.11ax, and 802.11n. Now, before I start dissecting these options, just remember one thing. They might use capital letters for the amendments to make it a bit harder to read. So if that does happen, don't let that mess with you. Just take a moment, read it slowly, you should be fine. So we're looking at best throughput and security associated with it. 802.11b was about 11 megabits per second. N was around 300 to 600 megabits per second, depending on who you believe. 802.11ac, you're looking at between 700 megs and 1300 megabits per second, again depending on who you believe. The standards do start to get a little bit loose when it comes to the speeds or throughputs after you go past 802.11g. And then 802.11ax promises you 5 gigabits per second or 5000 megs to 10 gigabits per second. So straight away C or 802.11ax is looking like a good option. Then when it comes to security, B offered us WEP, N offered us WPA2, which was way better than WEP. 802.11ac also gave WPA2 with various options, but 802.11ax gives us WPA3. Now, always remember this. WPA of any version number is better than WEP, and a higher number implies it is better. Therefore, C is our preferred option. Yeah, you have to know a lot of these things for the Core 1 exam just off the top of your head. That's why fact memorization does play a big part in studying for Core 1 of A+. Moving along though, to our next question. A desktop support technician has been tasked with creating a simple file share server for a branch location. Which of the following storage media would offer the best balance between data density and performance? Now, just to clarify before we get carried away, data density would be maximum storage capacity. That's what we're after here. But we also want good performance as well. We want a lot of storage, but we don't want to wait forever to use it. We would like it to be plentiful, but also reasonably quick. So pause if you need to think about the options, or at least imagine the options you'd like to see. But our options are a SATA SSD, a SATA HDD, tape drives, and an M.2 NVMe SSD. So performance-wise, you're going to get the best from a M.2 NVMe SSD. However, it's going to be quite pricey per gigabyte. So, maybe not. A tape drive will probably give us the best data density or capacity. However, tape drives are incredibly slow by modern standards, and we tend to use those for archival or long-term backup storage. So this one is too fast and too expensive. This one is too slow, but has the capacity. So that leaves us with the SATA SSD and the SATA HDD. Now, being a file share server, It's going to be online most of the time. Any applications and services are already going to be loaded, so we're going to be accessing data files mostly. And normal HDDs or mechanical hard drives work pretty well when it comes to just accessing files. The big advantage to an SSD is mainly loading software, which can be quite sizable and take a significant amount of time. Think about booting your operating system, opening an application or a video game. That can take a bit of time. But loading a Word document or a PDF, that's pretty quick, regardless of whether it's a mechanical or a solid-state disk. So we're going to get a good amount of capacity and performance for a file share server. And they did say it's a simple file share server as well. Maybe we do use an SSD for the server to boot with, but for actually sharing storage with users, the HDD makes way more sense. So even though it's not the fastest, it is a good balance of the two. And that's what they were asking for, is a balance. Moving along though, to our next question. Which of the following protocols is used for email communications? So think about the email protocols you know about. There's 3 main ones. And our options are DNS, SNMP, IMAP, and DHCP. I'm hoping you gravitated straight towards IMAP because that is one of the 3 email protocols. You're looking at SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, Post Office Protocol, usually version 3, so POP3 is a common listing, and Internet Messaging Access Protocol, sometimes listed as IMAP 4 because the latest version is version 4. I'm hoping that's what you thought about straight away. But if you needed to do process of elimination, let's do it. DNS is name resolution, not emails. SNMP, that was sort of a booby trap there because it's a very similar acronym to SMTP. But SNMP is the Simple Network Management Protocol, which is there for monitoring and possibly managing configuration of your network appliances. You'll learn more about that in Network Plus. And DHCP allocates IP addresses, subnet masks, and gateways, but it doesn't handle emails. So that's how we would tackle that. Moving along. Our next question is a bit of a big one. Yeah, even though Core 1 does tend to do quite a lot of give me a fact, prove your knowledge, they also do give some scenarios with this hardware-oriented set of information. So let's have a look. A drive failed in a RAID array. And remember, RAID is a redundant array of independent disks, so that's a bunch of hard drives that we get to work together. The administrator had to spend a significant amount of time rebuilding the array after replacing the failed drive. Which RAID configuration would offer immediate fault tolerance and avoid downtime? So it sounds like they've gone for a RAID array where they need to reconstitute the missing data. So it sounds like the original one was RAID 5 or RAID 6. So let's see what our options are. Our options are RAID 1, RAID 5, RAID 6, and RAID 0. So I'm going to straight away eliminate 5 and 6 because 5 and 6 use parity to store data, and that requires a significant amount of computational power and therefore time to rebuild the missing data once you replace the failed disk. And that's even if you do have a hot spare plugged in already. So I'm eliminating those 2 straight away. RAID 0 I'm going to eliminate as well because yes, RAID 0 is really fast, but RAID 0 does not have fault tolerance. RAID 1, however, does. The only downside to RAID 1 is for every disk you have, you need to have a second mirror disk that's going to act as a perfect copy of the active disk. So you have to buy double the number of disks than you actually wanted in the first place. Fantastic. Moving forward. A user reports a noise coming from their laptop. A technician notices that the noise becomes slightly louder and more regular during a processing intensive task, after which the performance of the laptop goes down for a period of time. Which of the following could the technician look at replacing? I'll give you a chance to think about the options you want to see. But our options are SATA HDD, the RAM, the keyboard, and the cooling fan. Now, let's work with some info here. We're hearing a noise. Now, a noise normally means something has to move. The only time you'll get a noise from a computer and there's nothing moving involved is something called coil whine. But they didn't say a whining noise, they just said a noise. So I'm going to eliminate the RAM and the keyboard. Now, you might say, hang on, but the keyboard makes a noise when I press a key. Yes, that is true, but we notice the noise becomes louder during processing. We didn't say the person was typing on the keyboard. Besides which, most people kind of expect a keyboard to make a noise and don't really pay attention to it. We're hearing an odd noise when the computer is working. Now, the two moving options in this list are the hard drive and the cooling fan. Now, let's review the scenario again. A technician notices that the noise becomes slightly louder and more regular during a processing intensive task, after which the performance of the laptop goes down for a period of time. That sounds to me like a cooling issue, because the processor is working harder, generating more heat. That instructs the cooling fan to spin faster. If the cooling solution can't keep up with the heat being generated, CPUs usually thermal throttle, lowering their performance so they don't overheat yet can continue to work. This seriously sounds like the cooling fan. If this was a noise that happened regularly, especially when opening or saving something, then I would have believed it was the hard drive. So I'm going with the cooling fan there, not the hard drive. And yes, cooling fans can be replaceable on laptops. Depends on the laptop, obviously, and the manufacturer and how serviceable they design the thing to be, but it is a replaceable part. Let's check out another question. We have a user reporting that their smartphone has lost all connectivity, cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and is unable to make calls or browse the web. Wow, sounds like quite a big issue. Which of the following is most likely the cause? I'll give you a chance to think about what you want to see here. But our options are: mobile data has been disabled, flight mode has been enabled, network roaming has been disabled, or the SIM card has developed an intermittent fault. Alright, let's work through this. Now, mobile data has been disabled. That could definitely explain the browsing of the web issue, but they're also saying the Wi-Fi is down as well. And mobile data would not affect your ability to make a call. So, no. It's possible, but not all of the symptoms are aligning with that root cause. Flight mode has been enabled. That's a pretty strong contender, so I'm going to keep it there for now. Network roaming has been disabled. Would that affect Bluetooth? I don't think so. Or Wi-Fi. So, nah, not happy with that one. The SIM card has developed an intermittent fault. Now, first of all, this is quite rare. I personally have not come across this myself. Some of you might have, though, but I definitely haven't in my years in the industry. Now, if it were to be the cause, though, that would definitely affect the calling. It would definitely affect any sort of cellular activity. It would affect your ability to browse the web if you were on mobile data. But your Wi-Fi and your Bluetooth work completely independently of your SIM card. If you don't believe me, think about tablets. You can buy a tablet device that has Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, but no cellular. So I doubt it's the SIM card. Flight mode does make a lot of sense, though, because when you turn flight mode on your device, that turns off all forms of wireless connectivity for when you're on an airplane. And you can turn things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth back on for just connecting to in-flight Wi-Fi or connecting to a Bluetooth peripheral, but it wouldn't allow calls or cellular connectivity for the web to work. So those options seem pretty reasonable, but flight mode is the most likely. And due to where the button for flight mode might be in your notifications/quick settings cluster, it could be something that the user accidentally pressed. Moving forward. Our next question is, which of the following cloud models would be suitable for a company that needs to maintain very strict and precise control over PII data, or personally identifiable information? So we're looking for a cloud model that offers control and security to the maximum. So let's see what the options are. Public, hosted private, private, and community. Now, with public cloud, you are using a public cloud service provider and you share this infrastructure with other organizations. You share it with other tenants. This is not ideal for an organization that wants to maintain complete control. Besides which, when you upload data to a public cloud provider, physically the data is with them. You have given up some fundamental and rudimentary control that can be very useful for guaranteeing security and legislative compliance. So I'm not overly mad about that. Hosted private, this is where you're using a public cloud service provider and you are the only tenant on a server. However, you have still given over that physical control of your data. So, not overly mad there. This leaves us with private and community. Now, private, you run your own cloud. Basically, you've converted your existing data center and server infrastructure into a cloud. IT becomes the cloud provider, the users are the cloud consumer. This would give better control and help enforce better security because you control everything from the hardware up. The only downside is you don't get all of the performance and cost benefits of going public. But if the main concern is privacy, security, and control, private looks pretty good. Now, community cloud is where the consumers also operate the cloud, but it's normally shared between multiple organizations. And although it would definitely be a lot more private than public or hosted private, it's still not as good as a full private. So I'm going to go for full private and scratch out community for the time being. If community was the option that was listed and private wasn't there, I might have gone for community, but I wouldn't have been happy with that. It wouldn't have felt like a good answer. Private is the better answer here. I mean, I myself actually run my own private cloud storage server for myself and my family. And trust me, it's a pleasure. Moving on. So, which of the following IPv4 networks is part of the IPv4 public address space? Give you a chance to think about the options you'd like to see, but let's check out what they give us. We have the 10.0.0.0 network, we've got the 192.168.0.0 network, we've got the 172.2.9.0.0 and 171.16.0.0. Now, hopefully you remember your IPv4 section from A+. The 10 network is private. So is the 192.168.0.0 network. In fact, everything from 192.168.0.0 through to 192.168.255.0 is private. 172.2.9. They're trying to catch you here. Everything from 172.16.whatever.whatever to 172.31.whatever.whatever is private. They went 171.16. This one is public. Alright. So if you remember your IPv4 address space, this should be a pretty straightforward question. But read the numbers carefully. That can be used to trip you up if you're not careful. Moving along though. A customer upgraded their GPU to be able to watch videos and play games at native 4K resolution. So in other words, the output signal of the GPU needs to be at 4K, or will be at 4K. However, they report that they are not getting the visual experience that they expected. After verifying that the customer's complaint is valid, what is most likely the cause of the issue? Alright, this one we're going to have to see what the options are, because there's so many things it could be. So, the computer is connected to the monitor via VGA. The new GPU drivers were not installed. The screen resolution is still in the old settings, or the GPU is defective. Now, all of these are very, very likely. So we're going to have to go on a few assumptions here, and that is okay to do when you get these scenario questions, to have some assumptions. Just be careful you don't do too many, because if you have to make assumption A that allows assumption B that allows assumption C, and that will justify the answer, that might be just too many steps to answer correctly for that option. Alright, so the computer is connected to the monitor via VGA. Considering they've upgraded to 4K, I doubt it. Most 4K monitors I know do not support a VGA input, so highly doubtful it's that. If it is, they've had a trouble connecting the graphics card to the monitor, because I also don't know many graphics cards that have a VGA output that offer up to 4K resolution, although I'm sure someone will prove me wrong. The new GPU drivers were not installed. That's quite probable. A lot of people forget that some of the hardware upgrades do need drivers to be installed. You could swap out your CPU, and chances are everything will work fine, no need to install anything special. You could swap out your RAM, upgrade it, add more, whatever, and everything should be fine. but GPUs do need their drivers to be installed. So that's a pretty strong contender. I'm liking that option. The screen resolution is still on the old setting. Possible. But that would be corrected if you installed the new drivers. The operating system would be now aware that it's got the ability to render up to 4K and would probably upscale automatically. The GPU is defective. That is also possible. Now, I would go with what's most likely the issue, which would be that somebody forgot to install the driver. Screen resolution, I highly doubt that is the person forgetting to adjust the resolution. If you do your upgrade and you assume everything's going to magically work out, you'd have forgotten your drivers. Plus, also, they might have gone from one brand of video card or GPU manufacturer to another. So, I'm not too keen about the screen resolution issue. And the GPU defective? Quite possible, but I doubt you would have a resolution issue. A defective GPU would give you a variety of other problems besides just not giving you the quality you expect. So I'm gravitating towards the GPU drivers need to be installed or upgraded. It is the most sensible considering what's just been done on this computer. They did do an upgrade after all. Moving along though. Next, a user reports when they print a document. The document looks washed out and unclear. They have tried different documents and multiple printers on their floor of the office. The printers are all laser printers. What is most likely the cause of this issue? Okay, again, another scenario question is probably going to be better if we see the options before we think about them. So here are the options. Read through, pause if you want to, but let's look at them. The user has economic print settings enabled on their computer. Surprising, but that could definitely be it. Let's move along and look at the rest. The printers in the floor of the office are due for scheduled maintenance. That could be. The printer driver needs to be reinstalled for the user. Or the toner is substandard and is not transferring and fusing properly during the printing process. And again, all of these are quite possible. So let's start eliminating what we know it can't be. Now, it is possible that all the printers in the floor are due for maintenance, leading to this issue, but I highly doubt they'd all be giving the same print quality from the same user. Some printers might be in more need of a service than others, so I don't see that being the issue. The printer driver needs to be reinstalled for the user. I don't think so, as that would have more impact on their ability to print at all, never mind with the quality issue they're having. So they're having no issue getting the print job done. It's the quality of the output that's the issue. So I don't think it's the driver. The toner that they're using might be substandard. And considering that they mentioned this is an office place, it is quite possible that an organization is using substandard cheap toner to save some money. But they did say it's one user having an issue, not many people. So if it was substandard toner, then everybody would be complaining. Here, they just said a user, not a bunch of users. So that leaves us with option A. The user has economic print settings enabled on their computer. And that option seems pretty good because if the user is able to try a print job with different printers and all of them are giving a washed out image, it could be eco printing. Economic print settings usually try to use less ink or toner on a print job, and it's normally done just for cost saving in a home environment, and that setting doesn't magically disappear just because you're in an enterprise environment. Besides which, eco-conscious and cost-conscious users would go for the eco setting if it's just a quick print that they need to refer to, but not something they're going to be sharing with others. In which case the quality doesn't really matter too much then. So I'm happiest with that option. Moving along. Another scenario question. After building and setting up a computer to run VMs for the IT department to test deployments and changes on, a technician tries to launch a newly created VM and it immediately gives an error message. What should be checked first? So we'll need to see some options before we can start thinking about it. So here are options. Checking to see if Secure Boot is interfering with the VMs. Checking to see if the hypervisor is properly installed. Checking to see if virtualization settings are enabled on the CPU. and checking that the guest OS supports being ran in a VM. So let's work through it. I don't think it's secure boot, as this would prevent the computer from booting entirely. Most hypervisors usually run a miniature, completely separate UEFI instance for the VMs if they need a secure boot capability. So I don't think it's that. The hypervisor being installed properly, that is definitely worth looking at. That is a possibility that we could definitely be looking at. Virtualization settings being enabled on the CPU, very strong possibility there. Just because a CPU lists virtualization features doesn't necessarily mean that they are turned on by default. You might need to go and enable them yourself. And the guest OS being able to run a VM, honestly, this is a very uncommon problem nowadays. Most operating systems have no trouble being ran as a VM. It might affect your licensing, it might affect your EULA, but normally not a problem. So between the hypervisor being installed properly and virtualization settings, the one thing that's more likely to be overlooked during deployment would be the virtualization settings. If you buy a nice kick-ass CPU that claims to be great for virtualization, you'd assume straight away that all the features are turned on, and that's not always the case. Hypervisor being installed correctly, it's very difficult to get that wrong. A lot of hypervisors, especially something that's meant to be simple and straightforward like a Type 2 hypervisor, it's just click your way through the installation wizard. And from what they've deployed here, it does sound like a Type 2. So I'm inclined to go with the virtualization settings are not being enabled on the CPU. Adding to this, A+ Core 1 generally does focus a bit more on hardware-related issues than software-related issues. It's not exclusively hardware in this exam, but generally it normally is a more hardware-orientated exam compared to A+ Core 2, where you'd probably be focusing a bit more on the software side of things. So that is the best option, I think, for this situation. Moving along. Next up, which of the following port numbers is used by Microsoft's native remote GUI tool? Now, you might be thinking, okay, what tool could they be talking about? Well, they say it's Microsoft's native remote GUI tool. That would be RDP, the Remote Desktop Protocol. So that should help a little bit. And we get port numbers. So port 22, 3389, 111, and 3388. 3389 is RDP. This is one of those simple do you know your port number questions. And yes, I'm afraid the only way to really learn this is just to sit down and memorize what port number has which protocol, service, or application associated with it. Once you get it into your head, anytime they ask you a question like this in the exam, marks will jam. Otherwise though, let's move on to something that's a little bit more challenging. So, which of the following is used to support tap and pay solutions for smartphones, smartwatches, and bank cards? We've got NFC, Bluetooth, RFID, and Z-Wave. I'll give you a chance to think about which option you like. Pause if you wanna. But we can straight away eliminate Bluetooth, as generally we don't pay through Bluetooth, we normally do peripheral pairing. So, phone to watch, phone to car kit, phone to transfer files, controller to gaming console, stuff like that. Z-Wave is meant to be a Bluetooth alternative for IoT. Again, not really associated with payment solutions. That leaves us with RFID and NFC. Both are very closely related as they both use the same radio frequency of around 13 megahertz. But NFC is usually the one that you'll find on the smartphones and the smartwatches especially, but also supported by bank cards to do that tap and pay solution. Whereas RFID is more often used for things like access control cards and stuff like that to get into a building. So NFC is the appropriate option for a tap and pay solution. Even though they are both technically the same thing, at least from a radio frequency perspective, we would go for NFC here. Moving along. Next up, after deciding on the CPU for a desktop computer, what would be the most relevant details to check for a motherboard? Choose two things. Ooh. So before we look at the options, let's just think about the scenario being given to us. We've settled on the CPU we want for a desktop computer. Then we need to look at the motherboard. This is a very, very common thing that is done. As generally most people care about what CPU they have, how much RAM, the graphics card if they have one. The motherboard is more of how everything connects together. Obviously, though, we do care about some motherboard features, but in general, the first thing is, okay, what kind of processor am I going to have, and what motherboard will support that best? So let's see what options matter. We've got the CPU socket form factor, the maximum RAM capacity, number of storage connectors, the PCIe features, like the number of connectors and the number of lanes, the chipset compatibility, and the type of storage connectors available. Now, all of these 6 options are valid things we would care about on our motherboard. But what we're looking at are the things that matter the most for the CPU and motherboard compatibility. So we're looking at CPU, motherboard compatibility. Now the RAM, that is not really a factor. The CPU socket, though, is. Now you might say, how can RAM not be a factor? Well, I'm not saying I don't care about how much RAM we're going to have, but it's not going to necessarily have a big influence over whether that CPU will work with that motherboard or not. What we care about when it comes to the maximum RAM capacity is, okay, how much RAM would I possibly need, and does this motherboard let me grow into that amount, or possibly beyond that? It's not really something, though, that's going to affect the CPU motherboard choice. And also the CPU does, in a way, have an impact on how much RAM you can have, but more likely it's the motherboard limiting you. The number of storage connectors. This is motherboard to storage, so not that concerned. Plus, for the average person, you want at least 1, possibly 2 to 3 connection options. PCI features? Kind of. I'm going to leave that in the play for now. But chipset compatibility, that feels good. Mainly because your CPU and motherboard chipset do work very closely together to create a functional system. And that feels like a good option. And then the storage connections, the types rather than the number of them. Again, if I'm not going to care about the number of storage connectors, I'm also not going to care about the type. We'll sort that out later. And plus, if we don't like the type of connectors we can always get an expansion card, assuming we've got enough PCI or PCIe connection points for expansion cards. Now, the PCIe features, that is a function of both CPU and motherboard, but we've already decided on the CPU, so that means we've already made choices with regards to the types of PCIe features we're going to have as far as speeds and lanes and stuff like that is concerned. Chipset compatibility would be a bigger deal. I want to make sure the CPU fits in the motherboard and that the CPU and the chipset can communicate with each other to create a functional computer for all the other components to work nicely from. So that's my 2 choices there that make the biggest difference and would matter the most after picking a CPU. Moving along. Next up, taking administrative control of an Android phone is known as jailbreaking, sideloading, rooting, or flashing. Now, I'm hoping some of you thought about the answer straight away as soon as you heard me say that. But for those that you need to work it out, don't feel bad if you have to. Flashing and sideloading are not contenders here. Sideloading is where you install an app outside of the App Store. Flashing is normally where you're replacing the software on some sort of flash storage. So that leaves us with jailbreaking and rooting. Jailbreaking is taking admin control of iOS, and rooting is taking admin control of Android. It's the same kind of operation, but because it's 2 different OSs, we get 2 different terms here. So rooting is the better one. For those of you that are wondering why, Android being based on Linux, root is the admin user in Linux. And jailbreaking in iOS is actually kind of a good name because Apple does keep you in a enclosed ecosystem. So you're kind of breaking out of Apple's jail. So let's move along to something else. An organization wants to migrate an internally developed application to a public cloud. They want to minimize any unnecessary changes to the application. Which of the following cloud service offerings would most likely suit the organization's needs? So we get software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and anything as a service. Alright, so it's an application they want to run on the public cloud and they want to minimize unnecessary changes to the application. Now you might want to go for software as a service. as that is where you are hosting applications in the cloud. The thing is though, the cloud service provider hosts the application with software as a service and you just get access to it. You don't upload your application to SaaS. So that leaves us with platform and infrastructure as a service. Anything as a service? Yeah, we could use that, but I mean, anything can be a service in the cloud. And I feel that they'll be looking for something a bit more precise than XaaS in a situation like this. The only time I'd go XaaS for anything is if we've got such a crazy scenario that it doesn't fit the original three. Then I would go for anything as a service. Now, infrastructure as a service is where we are going to have the computational resources like CPU, memory, storage, etc. being handled by the provider, and we get given that pool of resources to work with, sort of like a bunch of VMs running on a hypervisor. But it's up to us what operating system we use, how we deploy it, and stuff like that. Now, they want to minimize any unnecessary changes to the application. So I'm kind of digging the platform as a service offering. The reason why is a platform as a service offering lets me deploy pre-built VMs, and from there I can host my applications and services. Plus, platform as a service is great if you want to host your own apps in the cloud. You don't have to sit there micromanaging infrastructure as a service settings like you do with, obviously, IaaS. Although, yes, you could do infrastructure as a service, deploy the stuff the way you want to. That's going to require a lot of time and effort, whereas they just want to migrate an application that they've deployed internally to run on a public cloud. I'm going to assume this application doesn't require anything special from the actual underlying operating system services and setup. So I'm going to go for platform as a service mainly, as this is a great solution for hosting your own apps. A teacher at a school has recently purchased a new ultra-thin laptop and needs to connect it to the projector that only supports VGA. That's actually pretty normal. You'd be surprised how many projector systems still run with VGA or only have their VGA connection set up. What would be the best solution for this? I'll give you a chance to think about the options, but let's check it out. So the issue that the teacher is encountering is it's an ultra-thin laptop, and to achieve a thinner body, the laptop manufacturers usually ditch connectors that are quite thick. You'll see that they ditch things like the RJ45 connector for an Ethernet connection, and they normally go for the thinner and even micro form factors of things like DisplayPort or HDMI. They definitely will ditch the VGA connector. So let's see. Our options are enable WiDi. WiDi is not a typo, I promise. It's something called Wi-Fi display, where you can connect to the projector as it has an internal wireless access point. Often you download and install a little application, and then you use that application to project or cast whatever you want on the projector from your machine using Wi-Fi. However, they said the projector only supports VGA, so that's going to eliminate that straight away. It'll be a pretty cool option though, but this is a teacher at a school, and the projector only supports VGA, so the projector might be a bit old. Next, provide a port replicator. I don't see how having multiples of the same interface would help here. So, nah. Replace the projector. Hey, it's not a bad idea. Get something a bit more modern, get something a bit newer, which gives more options like WiDi. But this is a school, and not all schools have lots of money to spend on new equipment. But it definitely would be a long-term consideration. Getting an HDMI to VGA converter would probably make more sense, as it is very likely that is the kind of connector that an ultra-thin laptop would use. And an HDMI to VGA converter is a pretty affordable and simple solution that'll work very, very nicely. So I'm going to go with D. Don't get me wrong, I would still recommend let's get a better projector that supports HDMI, as VGA on laptops is becoming a big, big rarity. But that has not stopped organizations from just sticking to the tried and trusted analog connection that is VGA. Yeah, it's got some things going for it, but let's see. An organization would like to migrate their conventionally hosted data center to the cloud. They have identified they're converting their existing data center to a private cloud data center would be the best first step. Okay, so they've already decided how they're going to migrate. Which of the following technologies would be most suitable? Now, if you are in a disagreement with this, that they should rather go straight to the public, they've already decided as an organization they want their existing data center to become a private cloud data center, and then they'll probably move to public. And for a large organization who's got a rather well built out and existing data center, swapping from conventional service hosting to a private cloud solution is probably going to be the easier transition. And when they need more capacity, they launch that new capacity in a public cloud, slowly but surely moving over to it. So there's a lot of different approaches to a cloud migration. Even if you don't agree with it, this organization's decided this is how they're doing it. So let's see what options we have here. We could look at doing containerization. We could look at a type 1 hypervisor, a type 2 hypervisor, or a vSAN. Now, cloud and virtualization are very closely linked to each other. They are very closely linked. In fact, without virtualization, cloud computing wouldn't be where it is today. Now, they're looking at moving their whole data center over. So I'm just going to move out the vSAN here. Running a virtual SAN, don't get me wrong, is a good option. But I highly doubt the storage area network is the only thing happening in the data center. Containerization, that is great if I want to isolate just applications. But I've got a funny feeling they're going to be doing a lot more than just running individual applications in their data center. So virtualization is probably going to be the best way to take their existing data center and make it a private cloud data center, so they can more efficiently use their CPU, memory, storage, networking resources by having VMs that can be shut down, started up, and have resources adjusted based on demand and need. Now, in terms of running VMs for production purposes in a data center, type 1 is better for production. It's more efficient, it's more stable, it's just less flexible. Type 2 is not the right choice here. And the reason why is because Type 2 is software hypervisors, where you have a host OS and then a hypervisor running on top of it. You've got the host OS taking up resources and introducing potential instability. Type 1 is far better because you've got a non-conventional host operating system that is the hypervisor. It's more stable, it's just less capable of doing other things. If I was an administrator at this workplace, I probably would have a Type 2 hypervisor on my laptop so I can try stuff out, but I wouldn't rely on my Type 2 hypervisor to be stable. I would probably rather have Type 1 in the server environment, or my private cloud data center that we are looking at building here. So that's the option I'd go with. Next up, the purpose of thermal paste is to improve heat transfer from a chip to a heatsink. True or false? So yes, you do sometimes get some true and false questions in the CompTIA exams, and those can be quite scary. This one seems pretty decent though. Let's have a look at it. Thermal paste to improve heat transfer from a chip to a heatsink. Single statement, and it is true. It is the purpose of thermal paste. Cool, nice and straightforward. Next, which of the following best describes the function of a DNS server? So this is testing how well you know your network servers and services. So let's see. Hosting web pages and web apps. Hosting personal mailboxes and calendars. Providing IP address information to clients and resolving names to IP addresses. Well, let's quickly work it out both ways. DNS resolves names to IP addresses, and that is literally option D. A DNS server generally does not host a web page or web applications. Now, some of you might call me out on this, but that's more than likely an option of the DNS service you have installed to have a DNS server. Some might host a web service so you can log in and graphically administrate that server, but it's not a requirement or a prerequisite. Hosting mailboxes and calendars, that's not the purpose of DNS. That's an email service job. And providing IP address information to clients, that sounds like DHCP, not DNS. So you could either go straight to the answer you recognize, DNS resolves names to IPs, or you could eliminate. No, that sounds like a web server. That sounds like a mailbox server. That sounds like a DHCP server. Well, that must be the option. The final one being D. Moving along. An old desktop computer suddenly won't boot into its operating system. There is a report. The user reports that it has given no symptoms or warnings prior to that. A technician makes some changes to the firmware settings and the OS boots up. After rebooting, the problem returns. What could be the best course of action? So we've got reseat the RAM module, replace the CMOS battery, reseat the motherboard power connectors, or replace the whole motherboard. Okay, so let's work out what would and would not work here. So they say reseat the RAM. Well, if the technician changes some firmware settings, everything seems fine and it boots up. It's not a physical connection with the RAM issue. They changed some settings and suddenly it was fine. So let's scratch that out. Reseating motherboard power connectors. Again, changing firmware settings I highly doubt would affect anything to do with power delivery. If it was a loose power connector on the motherboard, then it wouldn't have made a difference with the firmware settings. So that leaves us with two options. Replace the CMOS battery or replace the whole motherboard. Now, B would work, but it would work very expensively. B is the best option here. The reason why, if the technician goes and changes some settings in the firmware, and then the operating system boots up fine, but then when they reboot the computer or they shut it down or whatever, those settings get lost. That tells me that the firmware settings are volatile stored data, and the CMOS battery is probably flat. And they did say it's an old desktop computer. So if you go replace that little CR2032 battery, you'll probably find the machine will work perfectly fine again. Now, the reason why I said D would work is when you buy a new motherboard, it normally comes with a new CMOS battery in it. But that's going to be a very expensive way to fix it. A CMOS battery is usually a lot cheaper than a whole motherboard. Besides which, new motherboard would probably mean new CPU, new RAM, new everything, and then you might as well just tell the person to buy a new computer and transfer their old data. So the CMOS battery is the best course of action here. It'll probably maintain those firmware settings between startup and shutdown cycles or reboots without costing a small fortune. And those batteries do need to be replaced every couple of years. Some computers do really well on their CMOS batteries. I've encountered a computer that's gone 35 years before the CMOS battery finally gave up. In general, though, you probably wouldn't be that lucky. You'd probably expect around about anywhere between 5 and 10 years, the CMOS battery probably needs to be replaced. Either way, though, that's the best approach. Moving along. Next, which of the following types of printers would be the most cost-effective for a home user? So you're probably going to be looking at a few printer types here and hopefully expecting a couple to appear. Let's see what we get. Color inkjet, color laser, thermal, and impact. Alright, thermal printers, very cheap to run but also very limited. So not great for a home user. Impact printers, also very cheap but very hard to set up for a home user due to them becoming mostly legacy. What's likely to be purchased by the average home user will either be an inkjet or a laser printer. Now we're looking at cost effectiveness here, and a lot of you are probably going to gravitate towards the laser because when it comes to replacing the toner cartridges, you're going to get the most pages per dollar out of that toner cartridge. But the thing is, the cartridge is very expensive, and that can be cost inhibitive to the average end user. I know that the liquid of an inkjet printer is a lot more expensive in terms of pages per dollar that you're going to be getting out of this thing, but the actual purchase price is going to be a lot more tolerable to the average home user. Also, depending on a laser printer's construction, the EP drum might be part of the printer, not the toner cartridge, which means after a certain number of prints, that EP drum needs to be replaced, and the average home consumer is not going to be happy with that because they're going to be wondering, why am I spending so much money, but I'm not getting more toner? So a color inkjet is the overall best cost-effective option for a home user. Also considering the fact that the average home user doesn't do a lot of printing, it'll probably be a lot more effective for them to use an inkjet compared to a color laser. A color laser makes all the sense in the world when you do a lot of printing, especially in like an office setting, but that's a very, very specific situation, and we're looking at a home user here. Moving along. To our next option. Which of the following network appliances will VLANs be used on? Now, the good thing is at A+ level, you don't need to know the intricacies of how VLANs work. You just need to know where you find them. And we will be looking at a router, a switch, a firewall, or a wireless access point. And VLANs are most closely associated with switches. Firewalls can support VLANs depending on the firewall. Wireless access points can potentially support VLANs, but then we're looking at enterprise wireless access points with a very specific kind of deployment. And routers kind of support VLANs if you're going to do routing between them. But for the most direct association, VLANs are a switch technology. That is why we go for that one. Do not worry too badly about how VLANs work though at A+ level. That is more of a Network Plus topic. So let's move along. Moving along. A technician wants to build a home lab to practice and learn. Kudos to them. They want to use virtualization to run various scenarios and setups easily. Yeah, I probably would do that too. Which of the following hardware configurations should they choose? Well, let's see what these configs are and make a choice. So pause if you want to. We've got a 4-core CPU at 3.6 GHz, 8 gigs of DDR5 RAM, and a 1 TB HDD. We have for option B, 8-core CPU at 3.2 GHz, 8 gigs of DDR4, 512 gigs of SSD storage. That's pretty nice, actually. The storage, I mean. C is a 12-core CPU at 3.0 GHz, 16 gigs of DDR5 RAM, and a 512 gig SSD. And then option D is a 16-core CPU clocking at only 2.5 GHz with 32 gigs of DDR4 RAM and 1 TB of SSDs. Now, what they're trying to test us here is on what makes for a good virtualization host. And there's two key things. Lots of CPU cores and lots of RAM. So we've got a 4-core, 8-core, 12-core, 16-core. So let's just eliminate those two straight away because the core counts are quite low. C and D give us the most CPU cores. Now, some of you might be tempted to say, well, the 12-core at 3 GHz sounds better than the 16-core at 2.5. But the thing is, when you're running VMs, more of your cores are going to be utilized. And having 16 cores open is going to be way better than 12 cores. If you liken this to tills at a supermarket, having 12 tills open versus 16 tills open, which one is going to get through the customers quicker if they're all working at the same speed? The 16 tills, right? So this is straight away attracting me. I'm not so mad about that. However, other factors come into play like the RAM. So we've got 16 gigs of DDR5 and 32 gigs of DDR4. Now, depending on what you're up to, the faster speeds of DDR5 at a lower capacity would be more beneficial. However, these VMs will be probably better suited on a larger amount of RAM, as you will be able to allocate more RAM to more VMs. And the speed difference won't be that noticeable with virtualization. I myself am currently running with a lot of DDR4 RAM to run some VMs, and I'm more than happy with it. So again, I'm liking that. Now, in terms of the storage capacity, the capacity of the storage isn't so much of a deal, although 1 TB is nice, and both are SSDs. And SSDs are kind of nice for virtualization, as they do give us a faster boot up time for the VMs. So overall, D seems to be the better choice. If C were the option available and D wasn't, then yeah, I might have gone with C. But it is not as compelling a virtualization host as option D is. So again, they're testing your ability to know what makes for a good virtualization host, which is CPU cores and RAM. The more of that, the better. Moving along. Next up, which of the following would best describe the use of IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service? So our options are hosting a virtual server. That actually sounds quite good already. But even if we do have a good first option, let's make sure we're not happier with one of the other ones. Option B is application development and hosting. You could do that with Infrastructure as a Service. But you could also do it with Platform as a Service as well. C, hosting of communication services such as email. Again, I could do that with Infrastructure as a Service, but I can also do that with a Software as a Service solution. And then performing off-site backups. So straight away, I'm going to eliminate B and C. The reason why is this can be PAAS as well. And communication services like email, that can easily be a software as a service option. So they're not exclusively infrastructure as a service. Running a virtual server though, yeah. I mean, look, that virtual server could be used for anything, but it's more of an IaaS thing. Offsite backups, yes, you could use infrastructure as a service for offsite backups, but this would probably be better as storage as a service, which technically falls under XAAS. So, yes, I could, but let's be honest, hosting a virtual server does best describe infrastructure as a service. So that's our better choice there. Moving to the next question. We have an organization that wants to effectively manage the risks of smartphones and tablet usage at the workplace. What would be the most effective policy model to adopt? Okay, let's see what the policy models are first. Oh, these ones. Okay, pause if you want to think about it, but let's run through it. You've got CYOD, or choose your own device, BYOD, which is bring your own device, COBO, corporately owned, business only, and COPE, or corporately owned, personally enabled. So let's focus on what it is that they want to do. They want to manage the risks of smartphones and tablets at the workplace. Now, the risks would be obviously loss, theft, and then malware exposure and stuff like that. Now, as soon as you let these smartphones and tablets at work be used for personal reasons, that's when you run into a lot of concerns, because that gives the user the power and the ability to install whatever they want. So I'm not so keen on the COPE, and I'm not so mad of the BYOD. Especially the BYOD if we're worrying about risks and mitigating them. The reason why is with BYOD, legally the device belongs to the employee, and you need to get their explicit consent to perform certain things on that device to make it secure, and you're still going to run into limitations when it comes to being reasonable. So if you are not comfortable with potential risks and consequences while being fair and respectful to the employee's rights to the thing that they bought with their own money, well then BYOD isn't the right choice. So that leaves us with choose your own device, where it's still corporately owned, and corporately owned business only. Now, corporately owned business only would be better for the security risk because the device is not allowed for anything personal. And that helps to cut down the risk quite significantly. It basically forces the users to keep their own personal device for their personal things and their work device for their work things. And that physical separation helps a lot. The fact that it is legally owned by the workplace also means that the employer can do what they like with the device to keep it secure. And if the user doesn't like it, well then they mustn't try and use it for anything personal. So that makes COBO the best option and CYOD not so great. The reason why we're not too keen for the CYOD here is you might still allow some personal usage there, especially as you're giving the person the choice in the kind of device they're going to get, whether it be like an iOS or an Android device, and that implies to them that they're allowed to do what they want with it. COBO is a little bit more strict. Moving along though to our next question. A technician has been asked to troubleshoot a file share server used at a branch location for an organization. Okay. The organization relies on these types of servers at branches due to unstable WAN services. The users at the branch report that they shut down the server at night to save power. Okay, reasonable idea. But it battles to start up, and when it does, it is slow for most of the day. While plugging in a KVM, keyboard video monitor, to the server, the technician notices an unusual, repetitive clicking noise coming from the server. What should the technician do first? Okay, so I am seeing a file share server, which means a lot of storage operations, and a regular clicking noise coming from the server means if it's a mechanical drive, it's possibly about to fail. That's what I'm picking up from this. So let's see what our options are. We've got to choose two of them, eh? So the first one is to back up all the data that they can. The second one is to check the optical drive. Now, it's not unreasonable for a file share server to have an optical drive, but I'm more inclined to believe it's got a large amount of mechanical HDDs inside. Clean the fans and the heat sinks. Could possibly be the noise, but it's a clicking noise, not a grinding noise. Fans tend to make a bit of a grinding noise. Reseat the RAM modules? Nah. I'm not even going to worry about getting through all the list before eliminating that, because RAM modules have no moving parts, which means where's the noise coming from if it's a RAM module. Prevent the users from accessing the server? Not a bad idea. Or replace the power supply. Now, power supplies can make a noise, but they're more likely to make a whining noise or a crackling noise if they're failing, not a clicking noise. So I doubt it's the power supply. Now, this leaves us with check the optical drive. I'm not likely to believe that. So that leaves us with A, C, and E. Like I said with the fans though, fans tend to make more of a grinding noise, so I'm not mad about that. That leaves us with A and E. Now let's look at A and E and just make sure we're happy with what actions they are. Backing up all the data that you could, that would be a good idea if you believe that a hard drive is about to fail. That way, if it does fail, you've got the data preserved, which, let's be honest, is what really matters. You can replace the hard drive and then restore the data. Now, option E, preventing the users from accessing the server, seems a bit weird, but think about it this way. If you prevent users from accessing the server, that means you can be able to do a backup more safely, knowing that the data is not changing while you're trying to back it up. Also, users accessing the server, trying to do write operations, are going to speed up and make that failure happen sooner, which is something you probably don't want while you're trying to back up the data, to save it all so you can replace the hard drive and then the users can be all happy at the end of that exercise. So I'm happy with options A and E here. Now, when you are tackling a question like this in the exam, be prepared to maybe read through the options, read through the question again, and then read through the options and make your selection then. It's helpful to do that, as you are able to then look at your options more critically when you've read through the question before and after looking at the options. Nonetheless though, that should be a good set of choices. Let's move forward to another question. Alright, where in a laptop is the wireless NIC most likely to be located? I'll let you think about where you'd find the wireless network card on a laptop, but here are our options. Option A, mounted to the motherboard. Option B, underneath the battery. Option C, near the touchpad. And option D, in the bezel of the screen. Now, if you were immediately attracted to the bezel of the screen, that's a no. They said the network card, not the antenna. And the antenna is what you'd likely find in the bezel of the screen. We're looking for the NIC, not the little wires that plug into it and go around the bezel of the screen. Now, finding it near the touchpad, I wouldn't be too keen if I was designing a laptop to put it near the touchpad, as that's a part of the laptop body you're likely to experience a lot of impact and nudges and taps. So probably not there. Underneath the battery, I wouldn't put it underneath the battery. In fact, you normally try and keep as few circuit boards near the battery as possible in case the battery swells or anything like that. Usually your network card for the wireless is mounted to the motherboard, so you can swap it out, assuming it is a replaceable NIC. If it is not a replaceable NIC, then it's going to be part of the motherboard, in which case then this question is pointless, because then it would be, oh well, where would you find the motherboard in a laptop inside of it? So yeah, best option, mounted to the motherboard. One of those questions testing your knowledge of hardware servicing of laptops. But the trick to that was they were asking for the network card, not the antenna. So watch out. They use their words very specifically in the exam and very precisely. So just take a moment, read through it carefully, you'll be fine. Which of the following capabilities is not usually found in a SOHO router or a small office home office router? Okay, so I'll let you think about the kinds of features and capabilities of your small office home office router. Pause if you want to, but here are our options. A modem, switching capabilities, firewall services, and proxy services. Now, let's see, what do you find in a SOHO router? We'll scratch that out because we're looking for what we don't find. So, despite what you might believe, a lot of small office home office routers do have a sort of modulator demodulator in them to cater for signal transitioning between what you're using in the LAN and whatever your WAN provider is using. So a lot of home routers do have a modem in it. So because of that, I'm going to scratch that out. Then a lot of your home routers usually have a couple of RJ45 connectors normally labeled as LAN ports, which means they are acting as switch ports. So that's not what we're looking for. Remember, we're looking for things that are not usually found in a SOHO router. Now, firewall services are a little bit of a stretch, but yes, you do find firewall features on many, but not all, home routers. Usually the firewall features aren't that impressive though. They're going to do things like port blocking, maybe URL blocking, stuff like that, but they're not really that powerful. As far as I'm concerned, with some of them, that even only offer you limited ability to block a dozen or so URLs. It's usually as a way for tech-savvy parents to punish their kids by blocking whatever favorite online game they're using at the moment is, assuming they can find a URL that will work for that. So, yeah, we do find that on many of them. So that leaves us with proxy services. And yeah, that does make sense. A proxy is normally a server on the network that you make a request to go onto the internet and go get some content. The proxy server then goes and gets the content for you, checks it, and releases it back to you if everything is fine. Your home router doesn't do that. The most your home router does is address translation to swap private for public addresses, but that doesn't mean the router is actually inspecting the content for you or going online for you. Ultimately, it's just changing the address. So the best option there is the proxy services. So, a technician has been asked to ensure that Telnet has been blocked on all computers. Good idea. Which port number should the technician check is being blocked on host-based firewalls? Okay, a question checking you if you know your port numbers. And if you remembered your port numbers pretty well, 23 is Telnet. If you needed to do a process of elimination, you've got port 25, which is SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. 161, which is SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. And port 123, which is the Network Time Protocol. Now, if you weren't familiar with all of those protocols, that's fine. What you could also do is say, okay, I've heard of port 23, and I know it's something that we spoke about in A+, I read about in A+. I saw port 25. If you can do that as well, eliminate the ones you're familiar with and not familiar with, you're in a good position. But this is yet again another point where in CompTIA exams, whenever they mention TCP/IP port numbers that align with particular applications and services, you just got to parrot fashion them, I'm afraid. The good news, though, is there's 65,535 port numbers, and we're never going to ask you to memorize them all. And in the real world, there's no shame looking up a port number at work, just to be certain you're about to work with the correct one, rather than trying to prove how well you studied for A+. Moving along. Next question. Which of the following devices is the most common and flexible LAN connectivity device in an office environment? Okay, so we're having a look at a networking question to do with network devices. So let's see what the options are. We've got a switch, a wireless access point, a firewall, and a patch panel. So they say, okay, which of the following devices? And that lets me eliminate a patch panel right now because it's not a device, it's a passive component that we just use to make cabling a little bit easier. So when they say devices, we're looking at something that's got a little bit of a brain in it rather than just a bunch of physical connections. And we're looking for something that provides flexible LAN connectivity. Firewalls are not about flexibility, firewalls are about security. So that leaves us with a switch and a wireless access point. I'm going to go for a switch here. And the reason why I want to go for a switch is because this can provide connectivity to desktops and servers, and technically laptops as well if they've got an Ethernet connector. But more conventionally with most people when it comes to a mobile device, they want a wireless access point. And you can plug a wireless access point into a switch, which then allows for the laptops, phones, and tablets. A wireless access point can only do wireless clients. So for that reason, I'm going to scratch it out. So that seems to be the better option, and switches are our more flexible choice. With a switch, you've got the desktops and the servers and laptops that have got RJ45 connectors still, and people that are happy to use them. And then for the wireless users, just plug a wireless access point into the switch. Very, very common deployment strategy in an enterprise environment. So switches are the most flexible LAN connectivity device for us. Moving along. Which of the following CAT standards for twisted pair Ethernet cables is unable to achieve speeds of 1 gigabit per second or higher? So again, another networking question, checking do you know your physical networking thingies. So we've got Cat6 cabling, Cat5e, Cat5, and Cat7. So let's list the speeds if you can't remember them. Cat6, you're looking at a solid 1 gigabit per second. So we're looking for something that can't get to 1 gigabit per second. That kills that. Cat5e is 100 megs to 1 gigabit per second. Although I've been perfectly honest, it doesn't do 1 gigabit per second very well. But hey, it does go close to it, so near enough is good enough here. Cat5, on the other hand, the one without the E, that is a 100 megabit per second hard stop. Done. And then Cat7, you're looking at a solid 10 gigabits per second, leaving us with Cat5. Remember, we're looking for things that could not achieve 1 gigabit per second or higher, and that's Cat5. Next up, which of the following motherboard components would be needed to utilize software-driven full disk encryption? So, motherboard that supports security. Let's see what options we have here. We've got the chipset, we've got TPM, we've got VRM, and we've got drive controller. Okay, so they've gone very vague on things here, but I'm hoping that you remember hearing something about a full disk encryption called BitLocker. This is a Microsoft service. Now, BitLocker has two modes of operation. Password mode, where you type a password in to seed the decryption key, and that will obviously then decrypt the hard drive. The other mode is TPM mode. What do you know? TPM is one of the options. It's a security chip on the motherboard that helps with things like storing a disk encryption key so that the hard drive can decrypt easily and automatically as long as it stays plugged into the same motherboard. If you transplant that hard drive to another motherboard, it goes, don't trust you, and refuses to decrypt unless you give it the 48-character recovery password, which you don't get to choose, by the way, but BitLocker generates it when you turn it on. Now, if you wanted to do a process of elimination, well, we can do that. VRM, or voltage regulator module, that's to do with power. So let's eliminate that. Chipset, this is more about coordinating components. Getting the CPU to work together with the RAM, the storage controller, the PCIe bus, etc. So, chipset's a little bit too broad spectrum to focus on something like encryption. Drive controller, maybe. You might have gone for that because they did say full disk encryption, drive controller, natural choice, but that was the red herring. That was there to distract you. The reason why it's not the drive controller is the drive controller's job is to make sure the storage media works and is accessible. The TPM module, on the other hand, is there to make sure the disk is secure and safe, which is kind of the opposite. So the TPM module is the better choice, but it is relying on that you know what BitLocker is. Now, if you didn't come across BitLocker while you were preparing for A+ Core 1, that's okay. What's normally encouraged is that you study A+ Core 1 and Core 2, and then when you're prepping for the exam, you focus more on your Core 1 topics, with the Core 2 floating in the back of your head. And the same is true when you do Core 2. Focus on your Core 2 topics, but don't forget about what you learned in Core 1. Ideally, you should do both A+ courses before attempting either of the two exams. At least that's the current advice. Several years ago and several versions ago, you could do the first course, the first exam, the second course, the second exam separately, and you could be okay. But now we've got a little bit of a crossover between some of the topics, which is fair and reasonable, because technology is like that now. You can't just put it in a nice little bucket or a nice little box at the moment. Anyway, let's move on to another question. Like, which of the following storage disks would offer the best performance? Let's see what we get. So we've got an NVMe M.2 SSD. I'm straight away wanting to go for that, but let's just make sure there's not something faster. A 2.5-inch SATA SSD. A 7200 RPM 3.5-inch SATA HDD. And a 7200 RPM 2.5-inch SATA HDD. Now, before we get stuck into things, they have picked 3 disks that have their size form factors. 2.5-inch is usually for a laptop. And 3.5-inch is usually desktop or server size. General rule of thumb, especially for mechanical hard disks, is that 2.5-inch mechanical is slow. Even though it spins really fast, the drive controller circuitry is not so good. A 3.5-inch SATA HDD would be better than a 2.5-inch. But we are putting them up against SSDs, so that causes C to lose out. 2.5-inch SATA SSDs are actually quite funny though, because there's no performance trade-off when they are made in the 2.5-inch form factor. Without showing my age a little bit, I remember when solid-state disks first came out. You could buy 3.5-inch SSDs for a desktop. And the only reason why they did that is just so that the SSD would fit in the drive cage of the desktop computer. We didn't used to have 2.5-inch SSD mounting points in the desktop cases back then. And cage adapter bays for 3.5-inch to 2.5-inch were still kind of new and hard to come by. So in the early days of SSDs, you actually did get a 3.5-inch, but the internals did not need the 3.5-inch form factor's actual internal volume to work. So there's no trade-off there. But we are putting this SATA SSD up against an NVMe M.2 SSD. These things are blisteringly fast compared to a 2.5-inch SATA SSD. Now, realistically, in the real world, you'd probably actually want to check what's the disk's actual measured performance according to the manufacturer. And that would be a better point of comparison. But at times, you will also need to make presumptions and assumptions based on the actual media and the nature of the media's design and the technology involved in it. An NVMe M.2 is generally faster than 2.5-inch SSD, generally. Sometimes that assumption is wrong, but more often than not, it's correct. And for us, that is the correct option now. Next, a video editor would like to purchase a new computer. Which of the following should they focus on as a feature that will improve performance? So let's see what they're going to list here, and then we'll worry about what's the right or wrong option. So they're listing CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage. 4 key components, but they're not going into details about which kind of component. Basically what they're looking at is, given a certain budget, what should the person try and favor to spend more of their budget on compared to other components? Now they are speaking about a video editor. Now in general, video editing tends to favor GPU performance. Now that does depend on the video editing software you're using, but overall it generally does favor GPU. So GPU is listed there. RAM wise, generally I haven't seen most computers have too much of a distinction after a certain amount of RAM. Usually around about the 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM, you're not going to see much of an improvement. Storage wise, yeah, storage would be kind of useful, but nothing that couldn't be supplemented with a pretty decent external hard drive or a nice fast NAS solution. CPU, not really. There are some video editing tools out there that do favor CPU performance, but not that many. I mean, the one I use does favor CPU over GPU performance, but only for certain video formats. So GPU generally would be better for a professional video editor, especially if they're using anything from the Adobe suite. Otherwise though, that should be a pretty solid option, and probably the option CompTIA would most prefer us to choose anyway, regardless of your real experiences. Which is a bit of advice here. If I was relying purely off my experience from video editing for YouTube, I would have gone CPU considering the tools I'm using and the video formats and encoding I'm using. However, you got to be careful with CompTIA exams. They don't want you to use too much of your experience. They sometimes want you to choose their preferred answer. And this might be one of those cases. Either way though, let's move on to another question. Which of the following would a crimper be most likely used on? Ooh. So crimper, I'm thinking network cabling tools. So our options are all networking. A PoE injector, a patch panel, multi-mode fiber cable, and a twisted pair Ethernet cable. Now, I am hoping some of you gravitated straight towards a twisted pair Ethernet cable. However, if you weren't fully sure about that, let's eliminate the other ones. Multi-mode fiber, no. With fiber, you use something called a splicer, not a crimper. It melts the fiber optic cores together. And for the connector, same story. It melts the fiber optic core into the connector. Patch panel, no. A patch panel uses a punch down tool. PoE injector, why specifically would I need a crimper for a PoE injector? PoE injectors just need a cable. And in that case, I need to make the cable twisted pair. So, not really. It's a weird option. It's just there to put you off balance. Twisted pair is the better option here. So it's pretty straightforward, but it does want you to know some of your basic hardware tools. Next, which of the following connection methods for a printer would offer the greatest convenience to the users? So we've got Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, and USB. So we're looking for greatest convenience for the users. Well, that's going to eliminate USB straight away. USB requires you to be plugged into the thing. You could plug in a computer and then get that computer to share with the users, but that's going to now depend on the printer and that computer sharing the printer behaving themselves all the time. And I'm making an extra step, I'm making an extra assumption. Let's just see if none of the other options are better. But I'm still not happy about USB. Bluetooth, it would kind of be convenient, but you're going to have to go close to the printer then. So I'm not mad about that. Wi-Fi and Ethernet. If the printer does support Wi-Fi and Ethernet connectivity, it can go directly on the network itself. But of these two, I'm going to favor the Ethernet cable because it's more stable than Wi-Fi. And the last thing you need is Wi-Fi performance issues affecting your printing. So for a workplace, I'd favor giving the printer an Ethernet cable. Wi-Fi, don't get me wrong, it's convenient, but that's for mobile devices like laptops, phones, and tablets. I don't know about you, but I don't see users carrying printers around with them. If I can get the printer directly on the network cable, get an IP address, and do whatever setup I need to do on the client so that they can access that Ethernet now network connected printer, that's going to probably be the most straightforward and simple. Also, it does eliminate needing to have the printer and a print share server / print share computer, whatever you want to call it, if you go the USB option. So the Ethernet does give us more convenience without having to add extra steps. Moving along. A small business with 80 users and 30 additional devices, we'll deal with that now, wants to set up a network for their office. Which of the following IPv4 networks would be the simplest to implement? Okay, so let's just break down this whole number here. 80 users normally assumes 80 client devices. They didn't specify whether they're going to have laptops and phones or anything like that, so let's just go with 80 client devices. And then they're saying, and 30 additional devices, 30 non-clients, whether those be printers or servers or whatever. So we're looking at 110 devices in total. So let's have a look at the networks they've got for us. 192.168.1, 172.1.8.0.0 with a 16-bit mask, the 10 network with a /8 mask, and the 169.254. No. That's not going to be an option. So the reason why I'm eliminating that before I even finish stating it is that is the automatic private IP address space, and that is a backup configuration for when DHCP fails you. Your computer will normally pick the 3rd and the 4th octet to be the host bits, and that allows for limited local connectivity. Not an option for a network where you might actually want to get out of that LAN segment. So yeah, we can eliminate that. So what they're looking at here is, do you know the effect of a Class A, a Class B, and a Class C network? This being Class A, and a subnet mask like that, you are looking at around 16 million hosts per network. I think that's a bit overkill for a network where we just need 110 host addresses for these devices. This is a Class B network, and what you're doing is you're looking at about 65,534 hosts per network. Don't panic if you don't know that number exactly like I do. I'm a networking professional. You're going to see when you do some of the other networking courses I've got here. That becomes very easy to remember. And then Class C, we're looking at 254 hosts per network. So this is going to be a good fit. 110 devices will definitely be fine in a network address space that supports 254 devices, plus we've got some room to grow. Although, yes, nothing stops us using the 10 network and the 172.1.8 network. They're a bit overkill. So, because they're overkill, I'm going to eliminate them. But I'm also going to be a bit weird. but I'm also going to be a bit weird. I know this is A+, and the security in A+, is considered, what's a nicer way of saying basic? Oh well, too late, I've already said it. But it is considered basic. When you start looking at Network Plus and Security Plus, you're going to see the advice of rather segment and break up your organization into different IP subnets. It lessens the impact of certain malware and makes it harder for hackers to get from one LAN segment to another. Sticking an entire business in a single IP subnet could be very dangerous and risky for your overall cybersecurity. But that is not what they're going for in A+. This is just me giving you a professional bit of advice and why you might see even a small network and a small organization of less than 200 people having subnets and different LANs or VLANs being used. It's done for a security benefit. Moving along though. Next up, printer documents from a laser printer are smudging when touched after coming out of the printer. Hang on. Laser printer smudging. That's something I'd have expected with inkjet, because inkjet's liquid ink, so yeah, there I can understand why it would smudge, but for a laser printer, that's really weird. Which component in the printer is experiencing an issue and may need replacing? Oh yeah, like I said, when it comes out of a laser printer, I expect that paper to be warm and that print job to be pretty solid and not smudging. So we've definitely got an issue. Let's see what they are listing here. So they're talking about the transfer corona, the EP drum, the fuser, and the pickup roller. So this requires you to remember your laser printing process and what's involved here. You've got your charging process, you've got the writing process, you've got your developing process, you've got your transfer process, you've got your fuse process, and then you've got cleaning. So running through this, what happens is the EP drum gets an electrostatic charge. The laser then writes the image to the EP drum, which causes that part of the drum to discharge. The developing process is where the toner gets an electrical static charge and gets passed over the EP drum. The parts that were discharged by the laser attract the toner to it. The transfer corona then pulls that toner onto the paper from the EP drum. That paper then passes through the fusing rollers to melt that plastic toner into the paper, and then the EP drum makes its way back around and passes under a cleaning blade to scrape off any unused toner, and the process repeats itself. So, judging by their complaint about the print is smudging afterwards, right up until this point over here, the toner is a plastic powder. After that, it should become solid plastic melted into the paper. So I'm feeling that the fuser has a problem here. The transfer corona, you wouldn't get anything on the paper. It would stay on the EP drum and then get scraped off by the cleaner. The EP drum itself, then we'd have other issues like the thing not properly printing, some blank spots, stuff like that. So I'm not inclined to believe that. And the pickup roller, that's the thing that grabs the paper. All printers have a pickup roller. So, yeah. Fuser is the most sensible here. If the fuser is not operating properly, it's not melting the plastic into the paper, which means you could smudge that powder if it hasn't properly melted. Or maybe it melted just enough, but when you brush your finger over it, it's still loose enough that it can get moved around. It's probably the fuser roller, yeah. And yes, you do want to be prepared for printers. They're horrible. Most of you probably hate them. I do too. But be prepared for printing an A+. Moving along. A user has a very processor-intensive task that they run regularly for extended periods of time. The CPU gets too hot and thermal throttles. Well, that's normal. Slowing the computer down and making the task take longer. That would be a consequence, especially if that task carries on while the CPU is thermal throttling. What would be a good solution to this issue? Upgrade the CPU, install liquid cooling, replace the thermal paste, and overclock the CPU. So all of these are going to incur costs, except for the overclocking of the CPU. And I don't think overclocking the CPU is going to help much. If the CPU is already getting too hot under its current performance level with the given workload and thermal throttling, all that's happening with overclocking is you're going to make that CPU run even faster, it's going to overheat even quicker, and thermal throttle even sooner. So you're not really improving the situation. Now, replacing the thermal paste, that could be the problem. But I'm going to go on the assumption that this computer is not that old, and thermal paste is unlikely to be the issue. What it sounds like to me is that the CPU is overheating, which makes me think liquid cooling would be a good idea, or getting a better CPU. Now, getting a better CPU could help, as a much more powerful CPU will probably find this task pretty easy to do, and probably not overheat as quickly. But that could be a very expensive exercise, especially as we don't know what the CPU is right now. Add to that as well, depending on how the process that is being ran was developed, it might be a greedy process. Give it more, it'll use more. So I could end up getting a much more powerful CPU that lands up in the same situation. Liquid cooling, however, that feels pretty good here. The reason why liquid cooling could work out pretty well is with liquid cooling, you are relying on water absorbing the heat, taking it to a radiator to be dissipated by cooling fans. Now the thing is, water has a pretty large thermal capacity. It takes a lot of energy to raise a cubic centimeter of water by a degree Celsius. So it takes a while before that water gets really warm. And that could allow that CPU to stay at its highest performance level before it overheats and thermal throttles for a lot longer. The only downside of the liquid cooling is it can be a bit more of a complicated installation and does require a bit more maintenance. Even if you get one of those AIO water coolers where it's all built into one unit, you do have to regularly check and top up the cooling solution. Otherwise, it might run dry, and then you've got air passing through a system that wasn't really designed to use air for cooling, at least not within the pipes. So I would say let's go for a liquid cooling solution. What's the worst? It turns out that we do need a CPU upgrade. Well, strong chance that liquid cooling solution could probably be migrated to that newer, better CPU anyway. So I like the liquid cooling option here. It probably would work the best. Plus also we're going to end up replacing the thermal paste anyway when we take the old cooler off and put the new one on. So that's a pretty nice option to test your cooling knowledge. Next up, a remote user who lives in an apartment building is having issues with their neighbors using their Wi-Fi, affecting their ability to work remotely. What would resolve this issue? Choose 2. I'm already upset that the neighbors are using the Wi-Fi. They're not paying for it. And secondly, you never know what they're up to. Okay, so first up, we could try decreasing the size of the DHCP pool. That could work. We could hide the SSID. We could use stronger wireless encryption. I'm feeling strong about that at least being one of the 2 options. We could change the wireless password to be more complex. That would be a good idea as well. If the neighbors already know your password, changing the wireless encryption alone would probably not be enough because they could just try with the same password again after you've changed the encryption. So those 2 do feel pretty good. And lower the transmit power control settings. Now the funny thing is, all 5 of these options are actually pretty viable. But they said choose 2. So I want the 2 things that would have the biggest impact, and using stronger wireless encryption in case any of the neighbors know a little bit about wireless hacking, and then changing the password to be way more complex for those users that just found out the password by the by. Would work out pretty damn well. But hang on, you said all 5 options are pretty good. So how would decreasing the size of the DHCP pool work? Well, if we decrease the size of the DHCP pool down to the exact number of devices that user at home has, and the pool has exactly that many IP addresses, when one of the neighbors connect, an IP address won't be available for them. But that can backfire in 2 ways. Firstly, because all the neighbor needs to do is just statically assign their IP address, and then they're on. Second problem is, if the neighbor is on their network before they are, then they're losing out on an IP address. So it would definitely slow somebody down, but not stop them. I would definitely do it to frustrate the neighbors though. Hiding the SSID, That actually is not a bad idea because it requires you to know the SSID and that the network is present there, in addition to all of the security settings. But the neighbors already know it's there, so it's not going to stop them. Plus, since Windows 8, you can now actually see the hidden wireless SSIDs because Windows 8, Windows 10, and Windows 11 onwards will say to you, there's a hidden wireless network here. I actually want to strangle Microsoft for doing that because Windows 7 and prior, if there was a hidden SSID, it showed you nothing in the wireless listings around you. Anyway, though, enough about my frustrations with Microsoft. And then lowering the transmit power control settings, that would actually be a pretty strong option in my opinion. You can decrease the transmission power of your wireless access point on your home router to only cover the area and distance you want it to cover. The problem is, though, this person's in an apartment building. If I decrease that wireless signal strength, when they are sitting at the edge of their apartment away from this home router, they're going to get weak signal and weak performance, and they probably don't want that. So the best two choices here is to change the encryption and make the password more complex. But all five are actually pretty good options. So when you're doing the exam, be prepared to have to make a choice like that. Moving forward. A technician has been asked to go to client computers and configure them with a proxy server's IP address. This is an example of what? Let's see what the options are. A transparent proxy, a non-transparent proxy, an access control list, and a firewall. Now you sometimes will get this where the question actually helps you work it out. These two mention proxy, these two don't, therefore ACLs and firewalls are out of the equation. Now if you're thinking, but isn't that a little bit too easy? Sometimes the questions do have something in them that makes it a little bit too easy, at least to get down to two options. So we're configuring a proxy server here, guaranteed. Now the fact that the technician has to go to the clients and configure the proxy server's IP address means it's a non-transparent proxy or a traditional manual proxy. It won't be a transparent proxy because a transparent proxy requires no client-side settings. And the reason why that can work is when it doesn't need client-side settings, that means the network forces or routes traffic through the proxy server, requiring nothing on the client. But a non-transparent proxy, also a traditional proxy as I like to call them, because that's what proxies were like back in my day. We didn't have transparency originally. That requires you to go to the client and tell it, hey, here's the IP address and the port number you need to use for a proxy service. They were a pain in the backside, though, because the users had to remember to turn the proxy off if they were going to work from home and turn it back on in the morning when they came to work if they had a laptop. So, let's move along before I feel too old. Next up, a customer has brought in a desktop computer that they have had for several years. They have regularly upgraded this computer over the years, but now it won't turn on at all. What could be the solution? Many things could be going on here. In the real world, you start testing this like mad, but in the CompTIA exam, let's check the options and work with what would most likely be the cause of this problem. So we could replace the SSD with a new one. We could blow dust from the heatsink. We could check that the power connectors are properly seated. And we could replace the power supply unit with a higher wattage rating. Alright, let's see, what's the issue? The computer won't turn on at all. I doubt it's the SSD. The reason why is if we had a problem with the boot disk, whether it be a mechanical disk or an SSD, it doesn't matter. We'd at least have the computer turning on and we presented with a BIOS or UEFI firmware screen. So, no, I don't think that's the issue. Dust from the heatsink? It could be that the computer's overheating, but surely it would at least start up and get some way through the booting process if it was overheating before it led to a thermal emergency shutdown. So, probably a good idea to do it, but I don't think that's the root cause of the issue. And if you ever do end up working in a retail/customer support role, where you deal with public customers, anytime you get a computer open, blow the dust out. You've got the opportunity to, you might as well. Check the power connectors are properly seated. Not a bad option. Or replace the power supply with a higher wattage one. I'm gravitating towards this. Somebody who is a bit of an enthusiast but doesn't spend a lot of time learning properly about building a computer might upgrade parts, but not realize that this new hardware might come with a higher power requirement and not think about upgrading their power supply unit. It's a very, very common mistake that newcomers to the technology space and building and maintaining your own personal computer at home often learn the hard way. So that's most likely going to be the solution. I would still have checked the power connectors were properly seated. I mean, I'd open the computer up, check things are in there, check they're properly seated, and then see if that was the problem. But one way I could be pretty sure if it was the power supply is I'd sniff it. I'm not joking, I would smell it. If you get the distinctive smell of burnt plastic with a little bit of funkiness to it, that's the smell of burnt electronics and a burnt out power supply. Chances are the power supply is not able to keep up with the new hardware and the upgraded hardware's capabilities. It's probably the original power supply. So yeah, I'm pretty strong about that option being correct. The power supply unit needs to be replaced. Alright, let's move along. Next up, a user asks a technician for advice on what kind of storage to get to back up files for their family. This will include important documents, photos, videos, and similar files. What would be the best option for this user? Now you might be saying, hang on, this is not for the workplace. Why do I have to deal with this? You work in IT, you're going to get the occasional user who likes you and comes to you for some tech advice in their life. Be prepared for this. And please, please, please do me a favor. You might think, oh, come on, this is basic and easy. It's not for the average user. I promise you there is something that the users at work do that's basic and easy for them, but is a nightmare for you to do. So be patient and tolerant. We all have our expertises and our knowledge spaces. Work with your users. Okay, enough preaching about good etiquette and professionalism. Let's look at the options. So first up, a 4TB internal HDD, a 128GB NAS. Very weird size for a NAS, but anyway. A 512GB external SSD and a 4TB external HDD. So first of all, let's relook at that use case. They're looking at doing backups for their files and their family members' files. Photos, videos, those are quite big in terms of file sizes. Documents, not too big, but obviously crucial. And other similar things. Maybe music, I don't know. So let's see. First thing we're going to want is capacity. And straight away, that makes that suck. Because 128 gigs is not going to get you very far. You probably get way more storage if you decided to use like the free amount of storage you get with Microsoft OneDrive. Alright, moving along. A 4TB internal disk. Internal. No. The reason why I want to scratch that out, I don't know what computer the user has at home. I don't know how comfortable they are with opening a computer up and adding a new hard drive and then making that hard drive shared across the network. Not too mad about that. Externals, however, I like those for this because it can be very easy for the user to buy an external drive, plug it into their computer, back up their files, go to their spouse's computer, back up their files. If they've got kids, go to their kids' computers, back up their files. Visit their parents, plug it into their parents' computer, back up their files. Yeah, I could see an external being great for that. Simple, easy, intuitive, works wonders. Now, the SSD does hold some appeal to do it quickly, but we're looking at capacity here. And 512 gigs is not a lot. 4 terabytes sounds way better. So I'd go with that recommendation for the user. A 4 terabyte external drive. Yeah, it's a bit pricey, but you will probably be able to back up all of the major things in a personal setting like that. And then just stick that external hard drive somewhere safe, and you've got a backup. Fantastic. Now, there are other options. You could tell the user to look at a cloud storage service maybe. But here's the thing. It's not an option. Sometimes you're going to get these questions in the exam where you think, nah, but that would be a way better option. Even though, yes, it might be a way better option, if it's not listed here in the exam, you go with what is shown to you. Pick the options that CompTIA puts forward to you. And if anything, it does at least have one real world analogy. And that is that the user is going to come with constraints for you, like, oh, that's a bit expensive, or something like that. Anyway, that's that question done.
So, that was 50 questions to help you prepare for this exam. Hopefully it helps you get more prepared and ready for this exam, and please let me know how it goes. And if you have any friends, family members, colleagues or peers that are interested in doing the CompTIA A+ certification, don't be afraid to share these videos with them. Otherwise though, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.